"Who do you think you're calling? The sheriff?" he sneered, mocking the man in the middle of the diner, all because he was a dark speck against a backdrop of white prejudice. But just 3 minutes later, the entire diner fell silent as personnel from the Pentagon arrived to escort him out, and no one had time to swallow back the words, "Who does that black guy think he is?" So, have you ever stopped to ask, who was that man? Have you ever seen a story like this unfold before your eyes? What state are you in? Watch to the end and ask yourself, will you still dare to look the other way? The breakfast diner on the corner of Pinewood Street was the kind of place where everyone believed they knew everyone else. A typical southern town with a slow rhythm, where time seemed to have paused several decades ago. The sign above the door was faded, the wooden letters peeling like the skin of the elderly, and the early sunlight filtering through the dusty windows cast a tired, pale yellow tone over the room. The old wooden tables had their legs propped up with pieces of cardboard to keep them steady. The rusting steel cashier's counter had a little bell that rang with a shrill sound every time the glass door was pushed open. The diner's main wall was covered with black and white photographs of local heroes, firefighters, veterans, police officers, all of them white men smiling with the stiffness of wax figures. Here everyone knew who liked soft-boiled eggs, who always ordered apple pie, and who sat at which table. Everything had its order. Familiar faces, familiar phrases, even the shallow laughs followed the same pattern, like applause in an old sitcom. No one here looked for change. Repetition meant safety, and that sense of safety was shattered this morning when Elijah Grant walked in. The bell above the door rang out, sharper than usual. Elijah, tall, lean, with deep brown skin, stepped inside slowly, like someone enjoying a walk. He wore a faded military jacket frayed at the elbows. His posture wasn't hunched, nor did he shuffle like elderly men often do. His spine was straight like a pole, and his eyes steady, which, in this place, was enough to unsettle. A group of men joking at the counter suddenly fell silent, half a beat too soon. No one looked directly at Elijah, but their refusal to look was just another way of staring. His presence was something that didn't fit, something quietly rejected. Elijah walked to the last table by the window, the one closest to the sunlight. He placed a burlap bag on the seat beside him, as if it held something more valuable than clothes. He removed his jacket, folded it neatly, laid it across his lap, and kept his hand still, like someone guarding a memory, not a piece of cloth. A young waitress, probably in her 20s, her dyed light brown hair tied up, walked past with a tray. She glanced at him, her eyes mixing surprise with a suppressed irritation. Her voice was flat, detached. "What do you want?" Her eyes never met Elijah's. He replied, his voice calm and low. "A black coffee, no sugar." A simple request, but in this space it landed like a statement. A few minutes later, the coffee was brought out. It came in a thin, disposable plastic cup, with no saucer, no spoon, no napkin. It wasn't served, it was dismissed. The kind of service reserved for people you didn't want to serve again. The diner's owner, a man around 50, with salt and pepper hair and a large belly, leaned out from behind the counter and frowned at Elijah. Their eyes met for a brief second. Within that glance there was irritation, sharp and wordless. If Elijah had been someone else, he might have looked down or walked out, but he stayed seated, his hand on the table, untouched coffee in front of him. A group of men nearby started murmuring. One of them, heavy-set, wearing a baseball cap, spoke loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "Who does he think he is in that army jacket?" The group laughed. Another man slapped the table. "What is this, a war documentary shoot?" A middle-aged woman pulled her daughter closer, whispering something into her ear. The girl frowned and looked at Elijah like he was a strange animal that had wandered into the wrong place. A group of young men pulled out their phones and began filming, not to help, but to wait for something entertaining, a fight, an argument, anything that might become a viral clip with a clickbait title. Elijah didn't react. His eyes remained fixed outside the window, where a cat leapt onto a trash can, where sunlight sifted through the trees, and where a delivery truck parked across the street. Even his silence was seen as a threat. Another young man said, louder, "This guy probably thinks he's at a veterans reunion." Someone else laughed and replied, "Nah, he thinks he's still in the war and it's a race war now." The words slammed into the air like a blow. The door opened again. 2 police officers entered. Deputy Cole, tall, broad-shouldered, walked with heavy steps. His face looked carved from stone, deliberately unreadable. Behind him was Officer Riker, younger, eyes restless, scanning the room like he was still learning how to read the situation. No one had to call them, but every glance in the room was a signal. No one said, "Help me," yet they all silently hoped it would end. And Cole, understanding what was expected, walked straight toward Elijah without asking a single question. Deputy Cole walked in with his black shoes speckled with dust and the familiar look of a man who always felt he had everything under control. The man behind him, Officer Riker, was still young, his boyish face not yet trained to hide uncertainty. They entered more out of reflex than in response to any official call, and just like everything else in this town, when a black man sat quietly in a diner for too long, it automatically became a problem. No one in the diner had summoned them, but the glances from those nearby spoke volumes. There were discreet nods, brief looks toward the corner table where Elijah sat. Cole registered everything without asking. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone else, and headed straight toward Elijah. "What are you doing here? Causing trouble?" His voice rang out, loud enough for everyone to hear, including those pretending they weren't paying attention. Elijah didn't turn his head. He remained seated, hands placed calmly on the table, eyes fixed on the window as if no one stood behind him. That posture made the air shift, not because he resisted, but because he didn't play by the town's unwritten rules. Bow your head or push back. Cole smirked, stepping closer, standing directly beside the table. His shadow fell deliberately over Elijah's back. A wordless message. "I am above you." Riker followed slowly, his hand still near his radio but silent, eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone who might intervene or even offer a glance of sympathy. But no one moved. The silence was thick with complicity. Elijah still didn't respond. Cole's question dissolved into the heavy air. The black man sat unmoving, as if the world around him held no weight, and that unnerved Cole more than defiance ever could. "I'm talking to you," Cole said again. "This is a public space. You're sitting here alone, not ordering anything, not saying a word. So what exactly are you doing?" "Sitting," Elijah replied, still without turning. The answer hit like ice water, sharp, effortless, dismissive. Cole's eyes moved to the coat folded on Elijah's lap. It was faded, but still bore the unmistakable cut of military issue. Cole didn't like it when people carried value not validated by the town. "Nice jacket. Military issue or something from a flea market?" he asked, voice edged with mockery, loud enough for everyone to hear. A man at the counter laughed, prompting his group to toss in a few jeers. A woman nearby muttered, "People like him don't know anything about honor. Looks like some war junk back too late." Elijah didn't react. He lifted his coffee cup, took a slow sip, eyes still fixed on the street outside. Cole leaned in further. "I need to see your ID," he said, voice colder now. "I haven't done anything wrong," Elijah answered, this time turning to look directly at him. "People who haven't done anything wrong don't sit like statues, don't make others uncomfortable, and don't get the police called on them," Cole replied, enunciating each word. "Or maybe they're uncomfortable because they're not used to seeing someone like me sitting still in a place like this," Elijah asked, his gaze unwavering. Riker watched them, something in Elijah's composure keeping his attention locked. It wasn't aggression. It was a calm so complete it unsettled him. He wasn't worried about Elijah. He was worried for himself. Something larger than protocol was happening, and he could feel it pressing in. Cole didn't retreat. He put a hand on the table and leaned closer. "We're authorized to request ID from anyone disturbing the peace, and your presence, from what I'm seeing, is disturbing people." Elijah didn't blink. "Then how many people here complained out loud, or are you just hearing noise in your head?" A chair scraped behind them, and a man stepped forward holding up a phone. "I'm not complaining, but I'm recording this in case anything happens. Just want proof," he said with a grin that fed off tension. Cole turned back, darker now. "Either show your ID or I'll detain you for verification." "Detain me over breakfast?" Elijah said. You think that's going to make this town feel more secure? This town stays calm when outsiders know their place, Cole replied, no longer hiding his disdain. Elijah placed his coffee down and rose slowly. He wasn't taller than Cole, but in that moment, the room watched them evenly. Some were smug, some curious, some just waiting for drama. No one stood with him. No one dared. Riker didn't speak. He glanced at the diner owner for a signal, but the man behind the counter looked away. Riker knew this was wrong, but also knew that stepping forward meant stepping outside the line. Elijah looked at Cole, then swept his gaze around the diner, locking eyes with face after face. No one spoke, but their stares said enough. You don't belong here. All right, Elijah said, hand brushing his coat pocket. If you think I'm a threat, I'll give you a real reason to be afraid. Cole lunged forward slightly, hand gripping his holster. Riker stepped in halfway, hand on his radio. No one in the diner breathed, but Elijah didn't draw anything. He stopped, placed his hand lightly on the table, and said, "The only thing I brought with me is silence, and you should be grateful I'm still holding on to it." The room froze. Cole couldn't react. Riker couldn't process the weight of those words, and Elijah turned his gaze back to the window. He sat spine straight, arm resting on the chair. His coffee was still half full. Outside, the sun had risen high, shining through the dusty glass. Inside, no one noticed the quake that had just passed through the corner of the room, where a black man sat in the middle of a white crowd without asking for permission to exist. Deputy Cole leaned in closer, placing one hand firmly on the table as if trying to stamp it with his authority. His eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Elijah's face like he believed that if he stared long enough, he could extract a confession, a hint of submission, or at least a flicker of discomfort. But Elijah remained still. His face was cold as stone, his gaze unwavering. "You think you're somebody?" Cole growled, his voice not loud, but sharp enough for everyone in the diner to hear. He glanced down at the worn military jacket on Elijah's lap and jerked his chin. "Old coat, old attitude. Sitting in the middle of someone else's diner like you own the place?" Elijah didn't respond. He sat as if the words had been nothing more than a fly buzzing past. That composure was like a slap to Cole's face, not with a hand, but with an icy indifference. A few people nearby began to pay closer attention. A soft chuckle came from a table near the counter, where a middle-aged man sipped his coffee while raising his phone camera, lens aimed directly at Cole. "I've said it before." Cole now addressed the whole room, as if performing on stage. "This kind is a seed of chaos. They think they can do whatever they want just because they come from the city. Around here, we keep order." A woman smirked, tossing her hair over one shoulder, her voice shrill. "Probably another one of those self-declared veterans, unemployed and bored, looking to provoke someone." Her words only fanned the flames. Others nodded in agreement. A few looked down, but none objected. Cole turned back to Elijah, eyes narrowing. "Papers." Elijah didn't rush. He opened his wallet, glanced inside, then closed it and placed it on the table. The gesture wasn't dismissive or provocative, just the action of someone who knew that no matter what he offered, these people were never going to truly look. Cole reached for the wallet, but Elijah placed his hand over it first, calm yet firm, as if creating an invisible boundary between the scrutinized and the abuser of power. "Touch me," he said, voice deep and solid as steel, "and you'll be writing a report for abuse of authority." In that moment, Cole froze, part surprise, part rage. He wasn't used to being defied, much less spoken to like that by someone he believed belonged to the bottom rung of society. The prejudices in his head were so ingrained that his reaction came as instinct. "Abuse of authority?" Cole sneered, his voice scraping like metal against stone. "I am the law here, and the law doesn't make space for this kind of arrogance." He snapped toward Riker. The air around him grew heavy, a mix of bruised power and pride, too stubborn to admit wrong. He clenched his teeth. "Write him up. Description, name, if he doesn't cooperate, take him in." Riker hesitated. His eyes blinked rapidly, his face tense like someone standing on a broken step, unsure if the next move would bring him down. He looked at Elijah, met his gaze, calm, resolute, not challenging but inviting him to face the truth. Riker turned away. That brief avoidance revealed the conflict inside him. He knew what was happening was wrong, but the wrongness had become so routine, so normalized, that someone fresh in the force didn't yet have the strength to stop it. The air in the diner felt thick, like old smoke. Eyes from every table remained fixed on the back corner. Some began to smirk, the kind of smirk that's empty and hollow. To them, this was just another performance they had seen before, and they believed they knew how it would end. A man near the window raised his phone higher, recording Elijah, and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "You've been sitting quiet for too long. Time someone reminded you who you are." Elijah didn't react. He didn't turn to look at the speaker, but then he stood. Not in a rush, not with a jerk, just stood, like someone who had made up his mind, like a post rising slowly from the ground, prepared. The chair slid back across the wooden floor, scraping with a long sound that seemed to mark a shift in the room. A few people held their breath. He looked around, not in a rush. His gaze swept across every face in the room. The men holding up their phones, the women who had turned their heads away, the younger ones wearing smirks of ridicule. Each of them caught his glance like names on a list not yet cross-heckered. Elijah didn't shout, didn't point fingers. He simply spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but each word dropped like a boulder into a still lake. "You're filming this," he said, eyes locked on the crowd recording him. "But not to protect the truth. You're filming to witness humiliation. You want to see me dragged down, like some morning entertainment." No one reacted immediately. No one laughed. The room seemed frozen. Eyes that had been certain just moments ago now flickered with confusion, as if they were seeing their reflections in a mirror and failing to recognize themselves. "I sat still," Elijah continued. "I stayed silent, and that's what unsettles you. In your mind, someone like me either bows his head or gets angry. I've done neither, and that makes you feel threatened." No one responded. A woman looked like she was about to speak, then closed her mouth again. The man recording quietly lowered his phone, eyes drifting away. In a room full of pale faces, Elijah's words cut through like knives that left no blood, but carved wounds just as deep. Then suddenly Riker's voice rose, soft, but as clear as wind passing through a crack in the door. "Deputy, maybe we could handle this more gently." The words dropped into the tense air like a stone into stretched fabric. Cole spun around, his eyes narrowing, his glare sharp enough to pierce his younger partner. "What did you say?" he asked, lips tightening. Riker swallowed hard, voice still unsteady. "I mean, he's not causing a scene. He's not violent. He's just drinking coffee." Cole stared at him like spotting a crack in a concrete wall. He didn't speak right away, but anger began to seep from his muscles, slow and dangerous. He turned back to Elijah, no longer wearing full control. Something flickered behind his eyes, a glint of doubt that maybe, just maybe, he had pushed too far. Elijah looked at them both, his expression calm. He didn't thank Riker. He had known that kind of hesitation all his life. It wasn't evil, but it was often the most dangerous barrier. One didn't have to hate to harm. They only had to stay silent. Elijah sat back down, folding his hands on the table. His posture was simple, unstrained, yet the entire diner knew this was not retreat. "I don't ask for respect," Elijah said. "I'm just sitting here because I have the same rights as anyone else. But if my rights are seen as a threat, then the problem isn't me." Each word rolled like embers across a cold wooden floor. The atmosphere had changed. No longer smugness, not quite silence. It was the beginning of unease, like a log that's been smoldering all morning, finally crackling with the sound of fire that can no longer be stopped. Cole clenched his fists. His fingers trembled slightly, but he didn't draw his weapon, nor did he step away. Riker straightened, his lips tight, taking no steps forward but not retreating either. His eyes remained locked on Elijah, no longer wavering. The whole room seemed to stall. Every person, every breath, caught inside a pretend normal. But all of them knew something very real was unfolding, and there was no turning it back. An older man in the corner gently placed his spoon on the plate. The faint clink barely registered in normal circumstances, but in this silence it rang like a starter pistol. No one moved, no one spoke. All eyes stayed fixed on the back table, on the black man who had once been invisible, now holding the entire room still. Elijah didn't look at anyone anymore. His eyes returned to the window, where the daylight had begun to stretch longer, pulling his silhouette across the wall. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the diner's worn sign, A dry leaf fell from the roof, spinning as it dropped. Like a quiet signal that something had ended, the room remained still, but everyone there understood this stillness wasn't an end, it was the threshold of ignition. And maybe, on a morning that seemed ordinary, the fire hadn't come from guns or visible hatred, but from one man who no longer sat quietly, stayed silent, and no longer stood alone. The sound of the diner door chiming didn't come from someone entering, but from a young man pulling his phone from his jacket and launching a live stream. His face peeked out from behind the screen, while the camera captured a clear shot of Elijah's table, flanked by 2 officers. His swipes across the screen felt more like hunting for drama than reporting it, and the glint in his eyes held something closer to sick excitement than curiosity. "Things are heating up," he muttered, unprompted. "Cops versus some black guy. Army jacket, too." The first comment popped up almost instantly. A strange username wrote, "Better be careful. If they go off, you won't be filming anything else." The boy smirked. Even better. And so, the phone silently continued streaming the confrontation brewing in that greasy, prejudice-filled air. Cole had no idea he was being live-streamed, but his expression made it clear to anyone watching inside the diner that the line between authority and aggression was starting to blur. He braced one hand against the table again, this time deliberately leaning his body forward toward Elijah as if trying to erase his personal space. "Elijah Grant, right?" he said, drawing out the syllables with a mocking edge. "That name sounds important, but around here important people gotta prove it." Elijah didn't answer. He shifted his gaze from the window back to the man fishing for a reaction, then returned to his untouched coffee. It wasn't that he didn't know what to say. He knew exactly what Cole wanted, a reaction, and he refused to give him that gift. Someone at the next table let out a chuckle. A louder, sharper laugh followed, like a cue taken at just the right time. A woman's voice rang out clearly. "He thinks he's something, huh? Must think that jacket makes people afraid of him." An old man in the corner spat onto the floor and grumbled, "These guys are pretending to be soldiers, all damn actors." Riker flinched. His eyes darted around the room, to the people laughing, then back to Elijah. But Elijah's eyes never left Cole. That's what made it suffocating for Riker. The older man's silence was no longer passive. It felt intentional, like he was biding his time to flip a chessboard no one else had realized they were playing on. "Say something," Cole pushed. "You sit there like you're innocent." "I don't see it." Elijah nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I know. You don't see it." "See what?" "The truth." Elijah raised his head. "You don't see because you've never wanted to. You look at me and see a problem to remove, not a person." Cole froze for a moment. Riker, standing beside him, began turning his gaze away from his partner. He looked at the people recording, then down at the diner floor, now coated in dust both literal and metaphorical. "That's enough," Cole snapped. "I'm telling you to get up and leave. No ID, no reason, no seat." Elijah slowly stood, but he didn't leave. He simply rose, standing slightly taller than Cole when fully upright, and that inch of height was enough to rattle the hierarchy etched in Cole's mind. Elijah no longer looked at him. Instead, his eyes turned to the people filming, to the faces hidden behind pale, mauve screen light and the soft clicks of constant recording. "Do you even know what you're doing?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "You're filming a man being pushed out like you'd film an animal being hunted, and you call that a spectacle?" No one spoke, but a few arms dropped. The younger ones began shifting their gaze, pretending to check their phones instead of continuing to film. But it wasn't awareness, it was the reaction of someone caught in the act, like a thief being seen mid-theft. "In your minds," Elijah continued, "I'm someone who has no place in the white picture you've painted for this town. And what unsettles you isn't that I showed up, but that I didn't ask for permission to exist." A young man started to respond, then swallowed it back. The woman from earlier adjusted her hair, eyes fixed on the untouched pastry on her plate. The old man said nothing more. The air grew heavy, as if someone had ripped the mask off the entire room. Cole looked around, sensing the shift but unable to explain it. He stepped back, then tried to reclaim control. "I don't care who you are here. You have no authority," Elijah replied, voice light as air. "Maybe. But one thing I know better than anyone in this room is this: the loudest people about the law are usually the ones who understand it the least. Cole spun around. He was about to step forward again when Riker's hand gently landed on his shoulder. "That's enough," he said softly, almost a whisper. "People are watching. The whole town is watching." That sentence, though quiet, was enough to stop Cole in his tracks. For the first time that morning, he no longer felt certain of his footing, and in that pause, Elijah sat back down in his chair. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to pull anything from his pocket. Just existing and remaining unshaken in a space where they didn't want him was enough to make the old order feel unstable. Outside, a child pressed their face against the glass, eyes wide, staring in. Their mother pulled them away, saying something no one inside could hear. But the child's eyes, so different from the ones inside, carried no prejudice, no amusement, only a question no one dared to answer. Why is everyone looking at him like that? And maybe that quiet question, left unspoken, became the first verdict this crowd would have to carry. Elijah said nothing more, but people began to realize that his silence wasn't surrender. It was a mirror, and in that mirror, everyone had to see their face. The air inside the diner was thick, like rusted iron. The eyes that once gleamed with smugness now only glanced at Elijah through the corners. The silence he brought was not submission, but a dark mirror, reflecting the raw exposure of a community that prided itself on order yet surrendered fairness to herd instinct. Cole paced back and forth, his hand repeatedly adjusting his belt, index finger tapping rhythmically on the holster as if by reflex. He had not expected things to unfold this way. Every step he took had always been backed by a town conditioned to nod when he spoke. But this morning he felt abandoned in a room full of people. That sensation gnawed at him like a wounded animal refusing to admit it was bleeding. "What are you planning to do now?" Riker asked quietly, his voice barely louder than a breath. Cole gave no reply. He just shot the young officer a glare loaded with accusation, as if asking the harsher question without words. "Whose side are you on?" Elijah remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze drifting slowly across each person. Those who had laughed with Cole now lowered their heads or buried themselves in their lukewarm coffee. The silence surrounding Elijah was not meekness, but a disturbance, one that left the powerful grasping for bearings. Cole looked at him again, this time truly looking, not to catch him in the act, not to assert dominance, but with the gaze one reserves for something they cannot explain. He stepped closer, trying to mask the unease rising inside him. "Nan par Trent, you think sitting still like that is going to rattle me?" Cole asked. Elijah didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the window, where the midday sun began to scatter light on the cracked asphalt. He didn't appear condescending or evasive. His composure did not carry defiance, but it weighed heavy enough to make the man standing before him feel shoved back without knowing why. "Fine," Cole said, his voice beginning to sharpen. "I'm done with the sit and act. Either show me your ID or walk out right now." Elijah turned, his eyes colder than forgotten ice water. He nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket pocket, so slowly that every gaze followed his movement. Unblinking, he pulled out an old, unremarkable leather wallet and placed it on the table. Cole stepped forward to grab it, but Elijah raised his hand to stop him. "I'll open it myself," he said, his voice ticking like a clock inside the room stretched taut. He opened the wallet and took out a plastic card, setting it directly in front of Cole. Cole squinted at the text. On the card was the seal of the United States Department of Defense, bold lettering, and a single line: Elijah Grant, Senior Defense Advisor, Pentagon Clearance Level 5. The entire diner froze, as if someone had paused time. Every breath slowed, every heartbeat hung suspended between disbelief and dread. There were no more clinks of forks, no rustling newspapers, no dragging chairs. The air felt dense, shattered into invisible shards as Cole picked up the card, his fingers trembling without even realizing. Every name, every digit, every embossed word on the card hit like a slap to the arrogant confidence that he and the crowd had worn so casually all morning. a confidence built on the false certainty that they understood who belonged and who didn't, that the rules of the room belonged to them. Even Riker let out a quiet gasp, soft yet audible to those nearby. Oh my God. Cole couldn't speak. He held the card up close, then lowered it, reading it over and over again, as if hoping to find a mistake, a mismatched code, a forged element, some flaw he could cling to as the power slipped from his hands. But there was nothing to grab. Everything on the card was valid, sharp, and irrefutable. And what terrified him most was that it wasn't a prop. It was real authority, recognized by places he had never even stepped foot in. Elijah didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, steady gaze fixed, his voice calm enough to force the atmosphere itself to recalibrate. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said, each word chosen like a blade carving air. "I just wanted to sit for a while. Maybe I was wrong to think I could do that in a place that still judges people by the color of their skin." Every word he spoke landed like nails being driven into the tiled floor. Each syllable passed through the listener's ears and left a resonance that wouldn't fade, forcing the entire room into an uneasy, almost shameful silence. You're a senior advisor?" Cole asked the question, spilling out unfinished, his voice tight, like he'd been choked. Not out of fear of Elijah, but because he couldn't bear the thought that all his mockery had been shovel strokes digging his own grave. Elijah looked straight at him, not a twitch on his face, no sense of triumph, only the bare clarity of truth. "I've sat in meetings where my decisions impacted the lives of hundreds, including people like you," he replied, every word marking a boundary between two worlds. "I don't say that as a threat. I say it so you understand that you just insulted a man you never even tried to understand." No one dared move. No one stood. No one interrupted. The silence wasn't a reaction anymore. It was surrender, not the kind born of defeat, but of running out of justification. A young man who'd been live streaming trembled visibly, his phone starting to wobble, the footage shaking as if reflecting his unraveling state. A few others hastily switched off their phones, shoving them into their pockets like that could erase what they had just recorded and helped create. But no one could escape the air they had thickened. Elijah hadn't started this storm. He simply stood inside it, unbowed, while they were forced to face what they thought they controlled. Cole placed the ID card on the table like it had grown too heavy to hold. He stepped back, feet unsteady. I don't need an apology," Elijah cut in, his voice unchanged. "I don't need pity. I need clarity." Riker stepped forward half a pace, drawn toward the pull of reason. His voice was softer than before, not because of uncertainty, but because of an emerging respect. "Sir, would you like to call someone from your unit?" Riker asked, his eyes locked on Elijah. "I mean, to confirm, or—" Elijah looked at him. In his eyes there was no anger, no condescension, just something that made people pause, a mix of compassion and disappointment, like a teacher who knows his student is capable of better but watches them fall short. "I don't need to call anyone to validate my worth," Elijah said, pulling his phone from his pocket. His fingers moved slowly, each tap echoing like knocks on a sky about to collapse. "About maybe," he said, voice lowered, "I should report that I just experienced a racially charged incident involving potential abuse of power by a local officer." Cole flinched as if shocked. "Wait, hold on." Elijah didn't turn around. He simply answered, voice sharp, firm, unwavering. "You don't need to worry, because I will tell the truth, and if the truth scares you, maybe that's not my fault." The phone began to ring. The sound echoed through the diner like an alarm from another dimension, a place where every action is recorded and every word carries weight. Elijah walked out. No one cleared a path. No one tried to stop him. Each of his steps left something behind, as if carving letters into the floor. "I was here, and I know who I am." The crowd that had once joined in now seemed to dissolve under the midday sun. They didn't flee, but they lost shape. The smirks vanished, their expressions hollowed. Every face faded in the glare of truth. Every gaze dropped as if avoiding themselves. Riker didn't follow Cole. He no longer stood in the shadow of power. He simply stood still, watching Elijah's back recede through the door, as though a gate had just closed, one not meant for those who lacked the courage to pass through. And in that moment, with the phone still ringing faintly, and breaths still unsteady. A question rose, quiet but haunting. Why does a man sitting still, doing nothing, scare them so much? Perhaps because that silence wasn't submission, it was a declaration. A declaration without banners, without shouting. It said clearly, I know who I am, do you? And to those who've grown used to asserting control to feel relevant, that question, simple, silent, undramatic, is the nightmare they least want to face. Elijah had left, yes, but what he left behind, like a mirror that won't break, like a verdict that needs no court, would linger long in the minds of everyone who had been there, because some confrontations require no violence. Only one person who knows exactly who they are, standing firm, refusing to bow, and that alone is enough to make an entire room look away. Elijah kept the phone to his ear as he stepped out of the diner. The glass door clicked shut behind him with a dry snap, cutting him off from the world inside, a place that had just witnessed a silent but fierce confrontation. The morning breeze whispered through the frayed collar of his worn military jacket, threading through the faded folds like time pressed tightly into cloth. He did not rush, nor did he look back. Each footstep landed on the uneven sidewalk like a seal pressed into the ground, not by body weight but by history, by memory, by truths long denied. His heels struck the pavement in steady rhythm, not loud but firm, like a lone marching drum echoing through the narrow street. Homeland Security, how may I assist you? A woman's voice came through the line, clear, with no extra inflection, sharp as a scalpel, brief, cold, professional. Elijah stopped beneath a maple tree outside the diner, its leaves trembling shadows across the pavement. He responded with a sequence of internal codes. Elijah Grant, internal priority, verify Griffin 11. There was silence on the line, but not of hesitation, one trained in protocol, not indecision. Then the voice returned, lower, harder. Clearance code verified, please hold. He sat on the stone bench across from the diner. His back was straight, hands resting lightly on his knees. Through the fogged and dusty glass he could see every movement inside, the lights catching Cole's face, pale with a mix of anger and confusion. Elijah did not smile. His eyes held no mockery, no satisfaction, only the calm of someone who had walked through war, through summits where words redrew maps, through windowless rooms where power changed hands without a sound. Inside, Riker stood as if nailed to the tiled floor. His body no longer carried the ease of a patrolling officer, but had become something frozen, witnessing. For the first time, his eyes drifted from his partner, from his superior, from the protection of the system. They turned outward, toward Elijah, toward the man he had just moments ago dismissed as some stubborn old veteran clinging to faded glory. Now, after everything, after Elijah had pulled out his phone not to plead, not to seek help, but to activate, Riker understood. Every word, every furrowed brow, every silence had not been patience, but surveillance. He, Cole, and everyone in the diner had just been placed into a test they never saw coming. The diner window reflected the image of a black SUV gliding into view like a ghost. No sirens, no flashing lights, no one scrambling to move, but its arrival immediately shifted the atmosphere inside. The silence was not curiosity, but something primal, the instinctive pause when a force larger than routine approaches. Two men stepped out, black suits, deep blue ties, footsteps exact. No one had to ask where they were from. They carried no badges, needed no introductions. Men like them arrived only when it was too late to ask who allowed it. One of them walked straight toward Elijah. He did not rise, but tilted his head in a subtle nod. The man spoke, voice low but crisp. Mr. Grant, we received the priority signal. Is an extraction required? Elijah shook his head. His eyes did not meet the speaker's, but landed on the diner's doorway. Through the glass, his gaze met Cole's. No need. I just needed them to see who they were dealing with. Each word dropped softly, not as a threat, not in anger, but like hooks buried deep into the minds of those who heard, not aimed at anyone in particular, but everyone understood they had just been named. Inside, Cole stepped back half a pace, a reflex, as if pushed by an invisible force. Sweat glistened on his forehead. He turned to Riker, his mouth moving but forming no words. He seemed to beg for justification, for agreement, for something to regain control. But Riker said nothing. His eyes stayed outside, on Elijah. Between them, a line had been drawn, clear, without the need for explosions. Elijah stood. He did not straighten his jacket, did not glance inside. He shook the suited man's hand, firm, like someone who had once given withdrawal orders from battlefields the press never knew existed. Then he walked toward the SUV. No one opened the door. No one bowed. He did not need it. The door opened. He stepped in. The door closed behind him, clean as a full stop. Every eye in the diner followed him. There were no more laughs, no more sneaky photos. No one dared speak a word. The mouths that had once hurled insults were now shut tight. The chair he had sat in still leaned slightly, the plastic coffee cup still on the table, cold, useless, a silent witness to how mockery had lost its grip. The SUV pulled away, no revving, no sudden acceleration, but the sound it left behind wasn't in the air, it was inside each witness. Every slow turn of the tires was a slap to the faces, still straining to appear unaffected. Every roll was a bell tolling. Cole stood still. He gave no orders, didn't shout. He only muttered to himself, like trying to make sense of it. The Pentagon? What the hell just happened? Riker slowly placed his glass of water on the table, not because he was thirsty, but because his hands needed to let go of something so he could speak. He's a senior strategic advisor to the Department of Defense, Riker said, his voice steady but firm, and you just picked the wrong man to push. Cole didn't respond. He had nothing left to say. Outside, Elijah leaned back against the seat, his eyes closed. No commands were issued. None were needed. To him, victory didn't mean forcing an apology, much less crushing anyone. He let them face themselves. That was the real triumph, when a person is forced to look into the mirror and ask, what have I just done? This wasn't a battle between cop and civilian, or power versus defiance. It was a confrontation between silent dignity and the illusion of control. A man who knew exactly who he was had just made those hiding behind authority retreat. The SUV turned off Pinewood Street, disappearing behind rows of maple trees. The scenery returned to normal. No one on the street noticed that something had just shifted, but inside the diner, everyone, from the waitress to the owner, from those filming to those sneering, knew exactly what they had witnessed. No one would remember Elijah's exact words. No one would dare recite them detail by detail, but they would remember the feeling of being exposed, of being seen through, of being forced to face themselves. Elijah didn't have to strike. He let them reveal themselves. And then he left. No thanks needed, no recognition required. He existed long enough, strong enough, clear enough to be undeniable. And that, in a world that insists on viewing people through prejudice, is unforgivable. But whether they accepted it or not, one truth remained. They had trembled, and they would tremble again every time they remembered that look, that voice, that walk. Elijah didn't just leave the diner. He left them with a mirror and made them look. The diner sank into an air of half-guilt, half-confusion. Disjointed whispers began to ripple out like oil across water, but no one had the nerve to speak loudly. No one dared be the first to say the name that had just caused the entire room to collapse. In the kitchen, the soft clinks of pans sounded like the ticking of a clock, marking a moment Elijah had torn apart with a single phone call. But the silence wasn't breaking inside the diner. It was unraveling from the phones that hadn't been turned off in time. The white teenager in the corner booth, still wearing his baseball cap, kept the phone gripped in his hand, his expression now void of mockery. The 8-minute video he had recorded from start to finish was already uploading. He didn't know why his hands were still shaking, only that the moment Elijah revealed his military ID, then calmly said, "I've briefed the Department of Defense directly," had shattered his worldview. What he thought was going to be a circus act had turned into footage of a truth this town had spent years trying to bury. "You posted it?" the waitress whispered, eyes locked on the screen. "Yeah, it's trending already," he answered, barely believing it himself. Within 5 minutes, notification bubbles flooded the screen, shares ticking up by the second, comment threads multiplying. "Someone find me that man's name." Is this Elijah Grant? I remember him testifying before Congress. My mom used to work under him when he was at the Pentagon. He's real." From shaky, handheld footage, the entire nation was now watching every humiliating second Cole and that entire diner had inflicted on Elijah. Cole stood frozen behind the counter. He had lost control. The video was up, and verified Twitter accounts were already reposting it. A civil rights attorney tweeted, "If you've ever wondered why soldiers like Elijah Grant stopped believing in their country, this is why." Below was a still of Elijah facing Cole, with the chilling stares of the cheerleaders behind him. No need for edits, no dramatic soundtrack. The footage alone captured a social execution masquerading as order. Riker sat down, hands gripping his knees, heart in chaos. He didn't know how to react to what had just happened. Elijah's final nod before leaving, the way he offered no accusations but let truth spill on its own, made Riker feel like an accomplice simply for staying silent. Online, people were digging through the town's history. Past abuse claims, deleted Facebook videos once discarded for lack of evidence. Now evidence wasn't needed. Cole's face, at the moment he realized he had been exposed, was enough. In the back room, the diner owner began flipping the sign to "enclosed" as if that could undo anything. "I don't want this getting out of hand," he said, but no one was listening. Phone alerts were still chiming relentlessly. In a small apartment in Washington, D.C., the glow of a laptop lit the thoughtful face of a young journalism student. The room was silent, broken only by steady keystrokes and the replayed video echoing for the third time. She sat motionless, eyes fixed on the frame. In the clip, Elijah Grant didn't shout, didn't pound the table, didn't scream at anyone, yet the force he emanated silenced an entire room, and it was that very presence that made her unable to look away. On the search screen, she typed each phrase carefully, precisely, as if piecing together evidence in a case. Elijah Grant, the Pentagon, racial discrimination, diner in the town of Reddens. The keywords were like golden keys, instantly unlocking a storm of data. She knew what she held wasn't just a hot story. It was a turning point. She wrote a short, sharp piece free of embellishment. She inserted the video clip right at the climax, attaching data about recent lawsuits against the Reddens Police Department. Every detail served as a backbone, holding the article upright. Within 15 minutes, the post had over 30,000 views. The number rose like the temperature in a room catching fire. No tricks, no clickbait. The story ignited on its own, powered solely by the weight of truth. She stared at the frozen frame of Elijah stepping out of the diner, phone to his ear, his shadow stretching across the sidewalk. Her fingers rested on the desk, eyes wet with tears, whispering, he didn't need to shout, because his existence alone was a form of resistance. In a world where shouting is often the only way to be heard, that silence, steady, grounded, confident, was the loudest voice of all. Elsewhere, hundreds of miles away, Cole felt like a man in free fall inside a building with no emergency exit. Every familiar foothold beneath him was collapsing, one floor at a time. Sitting in his patrol car, sweat clinging to his collar, he gripped his phone with trembling hands. His fingers stiffened as he dialed the number he always used to dodge trouble, to get advice that would ease him out of tight spots. "Lieutenant Harrison, I need urgent advice," he said into the phone, his voice quick and panicked. I was secretly recorded while on duty," but there was no immediate response, not due to signal delay, but because of a strange, heavy silence. Then came a deep, burdened sigh, the kind you hear when someone lays something down for good, or when someone lays you out of their protection. "Cole," Harrison's voice finally came, low and cold. "I saw the video. Don't call me again. This is beyond me now." The line cut off. No further explanation, no "stay calm," no "we'll handle this." Just a rejection, firm and final, like a door slammed in the face of someone left outside. Cole let the phone drop to the floor of the car. The sound of it hitting wasn't loud, but in his mind it rang like a gunshot. Nothing could save him now. Those who once defended him, who once raised him as a symbol of order, were now silent. Not because they disagreed with him, but because they were afraid of going down with him, afraid of losing face as public outrage roared, and no one wanted to sink with a ship whose rudder had snapped. That night, the video aired on national television. Every network had it. A special news segment cut into primetime entertainment. The screen split in two. One side showing the small diner in Reddens, the other Elijah standing in that hostile room, unmoved, simply watching. The anchor spoke calmly. Sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs the right phone and a person strong enough not to respond with anger. Elijah issued no statement, no press conference, no social media accounts lit up. He vanished from the media radar right after the incident. But that silence only drove coverage deeper, and when nothing could be found to use against him, all that was left was admission. The next day, a Department of Defense spokesperson appeared at a quick press briefing. His face was tense, but he was prepared. Mr. Elijah Grant is a special advisor, he said. He has served in cross-agency strategy roles in the Middle East, East Africa, and Central Command. Then he paused, looking straight into the camera. We regret that someone who served this country for nearly 30 years was treated this way. No one questioned him. No one needed to. The words were heavy enough. The story didn't end on social media. It slid off the screen and into daily life, across campus hallways, dinner tables, class reunions, and workplace group chats. People began using his real name, not that black guy in the video, but Elijah Grant. At family dinners, children looked up and asked their parents, why was that man treated that way just because of his skin color? And for the first time, many adults had no answer. Elijah remained silent. No rebuttal, no defense, no glory-seeking. The way he stood in that stifling room, eyes steady, voice calm, was enough to make all excuses sound ridiculous. He didn't show up to win. He came to preserve his dignity, and that in itself was the greatest victory. He had left the diner, but the diner, and everyone in it, couldn't leave him. His name, his face, his upright posture became a symbol, not voted into existence, but undeniable all the same. From that day on, whenever someone stepped into a small-town diner anywhere across the country, they would remember that story, not through details, but through a feeling. The feeling of being exposed, being challenged, being forced to choose. If it were me, which side would I stand on? And that question, not the slogans, not the accusations, is what lingers longest. Elijah didn't need to be remembered as a victim. He only needed them to remember. Once, a man didn't need to shout, and still, the whole country listened. The first text hit Riker's phone at 6 in the morning, while he was still curled up on the couch in the makeshift break room at the Reddens Town Police Station. It was a brief, 6-word message. Are you planning to speak up? But what made his chest tighten was the name of the sender, Aaliyah, the ex-girlfriend who had once left him, saying, choosing to stay silent in the face of wrong is more dangerous than committing it. And now, for the first time in 3 years, she reached out, not to reconnect, but to ask, who are you in this story? Riker didn't reply. He sat up, pillow lines still on his face, his thoughts tangled, feeling both like the man on camera and the bystander watching it unfold. In the online world now shaken by the Elijah video, Riker was nothing but a blurred figure standing next to Cole. He hadn't shoved Elijah, hadn't shouted at him, but he hadn't intervened either. He stood there, silent, the textbook definition of someone who did nothing, a role the internet now labeled as passive accomplice. Cole was another story. He was no longer in town. An internal message from higher-ups confirmed that Cole had been temporarily suspended to facilitate investigation. The language was polished, but everyone knew the truth. The public backlash was so fierce that anyone linked to the incident was swept away. No way back. He used to sit at the interrogation desk with pride. Now he'd been summoned under internal containment, barred from public comment. Rumor had it Cole was planning to sue the diner for allowing filming, but everyone knew that once you became a viral villain, the law stopped being a shield and became a double-edged blade. Ruby's Diner, once self-proclaimed as the soul of the town, had to hang a closed indefinitely sign that morning. Another video, posted by the diner owner's daughter, showed a family argument breaking out. She was yelling at her father, Why didn't you kick the cops out from the start?" And the man, who used to laugh about black customers paying in coins, could only mutter, "I didn't know it was someone like that," a sentence that enraged the internet more than the original incident, for it exposed the root of prejudice. That respect for black people only came once their power was revealed. That morning, major news outlets began running headlines with pointed critique. "When America judges by skin color and regrets it when they wore the flag." Elijah said nothing, but an official post from the Department of Defense verifying his background and role went viral. The media dug into dozens of old files. Stories of former service members now struggling, being denied service, mocked in public, simply for being black. And so Elijah, though he never once spoke, became a symbol. A symbol not because he did anything extraordinary, but because he did nothing, and was still dragged through the mud. In Washington, D.C., a group of law students hosted a panel titled "The Silent Gaze," when existence itself is considered provocation. The speaker opened with Elijah's line, "I came to eat breakfast. Turns out my skin color was the main course for their contempt." Over 1,000 concurrent livestream viewers flooded the comments. "He didn't get angry, but we should be angry for him." Riker stepped out of the break room, eyes red. He saw his co-workers clustered around the main desk. Whispers low but unmistakable, they were talking about it. One turned to him and nodded. No blame in the gesture, but in the eyes was the emotion Riker hated most. Pity, and he knew pity was the first step toward being cast out. By midday, the town's mayor appeared before reporters, looking worn, reading a short statement. "Reddens is committed to zero tolerance for abuse of power and racial discrimination. We will fully cooperate in the investigation." No applause. Everyone knew those words should have been said earlier, not after online calls for an independent probe and civil rights groups announced plans to protest at City Hall. That afternoon, a handwritten letter surfaced online, confirmed to be from Elijah Grant. There were no threats, no accusations, only a single closing line. "I forgive them, but I will not forget, because one day the next generation will ask me, 'Why didn't you tell us this still happens?' And I need to have an answer." That letter silenced the entire nation. People began revisiting old statements, similar incidents, and asked themselves, if that video hadn't existed, would anyone have believed Elijah? Night fell, and social media kept heating up. Accounts that had remained silent began posting in support. White veterans, veteran organizations, and even individuals who had once held conservative views shared images of Elijah with captions reading, "He was a soldier, and America betrayed him." A new hashtag emerged, "We Saw Elijah," pulling in millions of posts recounting moments when people of color had been treated unfairly without anyone there to record it. Elijah remained silent, appeared nowhere, and gave no interviews. But that silence had now become the loudest voice, because it forced everyone else to speak for him. And when an entire nation begins to tell the story on behalf of a man once turned away by a whole diner, it's no longer just a video, it's a beginning. The morning at the Regional Investigative Office didn't start with a knock on the door, but with a flood of urgent emails titled "Request for Immediate Review, Elijah Grant Incident." The Department of Justice officially requested a federal investigation into racial discrimination and police misconduct in the town of Reddens. The video links attached to the case file were marked Level 1, Public Crisis, the highest urgency level for incidents that could trigger a nationwide social response. One of the agents assigned to lead the coordination was Internal Affairs investigator Charlotte Hughes, who had more than 10 years of experience investigating civil rights violations. Charlotte placed the case file on her desk and scanned each line of the description quickly. Just a day earlier, she had assumed this was another viral clip like so many others. But when she reached the line stating, "Victim is Elijah Grant, Senior Strategic Advisor to the Department of Defense, with declassified records and multinational counterterrorism operations," her hand froze mid-note. She looked at the photo of Elijah's face. then back at the screen, stopping at the frame where he looked directly at Cole without saying a word, a gaze that cut through every layer of rationalization. In the town of Reddens, the police station was engulfed by pressure from every direction. A civilian group led by military veterans had gathered in front of City Hall, holding banners demanding "Restore honor to Elijah Grant" and "Stop disrespecting those who serve the nation." Meanwhile, chaos reigned inside the station. Chief Harrison called an emergency meeting with the command staff. Questions came one after another. Who authorized the two officers to approach an individual showing no signs of a crime? Has anyone previously filed complaints against Cole? Why did no one intervene when the situation escalated to the point that a civilian had to step in? Riker sat at the end of the table, silent, fingers laced, eyes lowered. He knew full well that although he hadn't instigated the incident, his silence had become a double-edged blade. At that moment, Cole hadn't needed an accomplice. He just needed someone to stand beside him to legitimize the authority he believed to be untouchable. And Riker, by not stepping back, had helped make Cole's posture appear as law enforcement. On the phone, a major network reporter posed a question to the Pentagon spokesperson. "Has Mr. Grant made any official statement regarding the incident?" The spokesperson responded with a single sentence, brief yet resounding. "Mr. Grant declines to comment. However, he is cooperating fully with the Office of the Special Inspector to provide all necessary evidence." A calm reply, but one that struck directly. Elijah wasn't seeking fame, he was seeking justice. At the Internal Affairs Office, Charlotte placed a direct call to Elijah. On the other end, his voice came through, low, steady, but each word sharp as a blade. "I will provide you with footage from my body-worn camera, the kind only issued for high-security clearance missions." Charlotte paused, then asked carefully, "You recorded the incident?" Elijah replied simply, "I always document every public interaction, especially when I'm alone and in uniform." There was no anger in his tone, only a calm that weighed heavily on the listener. That afternoon, the footage from Elijah's camera was submitted. It captured everything: the condescending look from the diner owner, Cole walking in without greeting anyone, and the moment Elijah said, "I believe I haven't broken any laws, officer." His voice was measured, unwavering. The audio also contained a crucial detail: mocking laughter from nearby customers and an audible remark. "He thinks that uniform's gonna save him?" Charlotte struck the desk. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just hateful behavior, but a coordinated contempt, deliberate and validated by those around. The next morning, the Department of Justice officially announced a criminal investigation into Cole for abuse of authority with racial bias, resulting in the violation of a citizen's dignity, also reviewing potential complicity or cover-up by Riker and Cole's direct supervisors. Public reaction was immediate and explosive. The hashtag #JusticeForElijah soared to the top of national trends, while the Ruby's Diner social media page was flooded with thousands of one-star reviews and furious comments. Civil rights organizations began mobilizing. An independent legal team proposed that Elijah file a comprehensive lawsuit, not just against Cole, but against the entire system that enabled the incident. Elijah remained silent, but his legal team began preparing the case. One clause was written with clarity: "This is not for compensation. This is to establish precedent." An article about the incident was published in The Atlantic, titled "The Soldier Called a Nuisance" and "The Country That Must Rethink Its Values." It included the line, "Elijah Grant didn't pound the table, didn't throw a chair, didn't raise his voice. He simply entered a diner as any citizen would and left as a symbol of a nation conflicted with the ideals it once claimed to protect." The article went viral, prompting not only those who had stayed silent, but even some who had taken the opposing stance to begin reconsidering. And then something no one expected happened. A seasoned police officer in another state, a man who had once received a medal for saving a civilian's life, posted a video confession. "I once treated a soldier like that. I didn't go so far as to insult him, but I used to think they should act more humble. Now I realize I was wrong." The video received over 2 million views in 2 days, not because he cried, but because he dared to admit it. In a small auditorium where a group of high school students held a presentation on justice, A large poster featured Elijah standing in front of the diner door, looking straight into the camera. Beneath the photo were the words, "He didn't need to shout to make us listen." And indeed, the entire nation was listening, not because Elijah said something new, but because those who once refused to hear now had no choice but to look. 10 days after the video was posted, Elijah Grant had still not appeared in any newspapers or on any television channels. But somehow that silence only amplified the reach of the story. Social media remained ablaze. Every platform was filled with thousands of posts, analytical videos, and clips dissecting every expression, every glance he made in Ruby's diner. And the more they analyzed, the more people realized what haunted them was not Cole's actions, but the way Elijah stood in the middle of that crowd, calm, without hate, without retaliation, and full of dignity. That night, a well-known political figure, a former White House counsel, posted a statement that stopped millions in their tracks. I met him once when we worked on reconstruction efforts in Syria. Elijah was the only person in the room who could make generals and politicians sit silently and listen. And today, I've watched that video over and over, and I see an America ashamed of its reflection. It was no longer just a video. It was a mirror held up to society where a black man, even one who had bled for his country, could still be treated like trash in the eyes of those who wore uniforms and believed they had the right to judge. But this time they picked the wrong person, and that mistake became the very reason millions of people began to speak up. From states as far as Oregon to the tip of Florida, candlelight vigils were held simultaneously to pray for those who were insulted like Elijah, but had no camera there. The image of him walking out of the diner with two pale-faced officers behind him became a symbol. In New York City, it was printed on fabric and hung outside the United Nations building with the words, "Dignity is not earned, it is inherent." Reporters from major networks began knocking on the doors of every place he'd ever worked. In Virginia, a former manager shared, "Elijah was always the first to arrive, the last to leave. He might have been a military legend, but in the office he brewed coffee for every colleague and always spoke formally, even with interns." That simple story spread widely because people saw that what had been humiliated in the video was not just one man. It was the very essence of decency, crushed under collective indifference. At the Department of Defense headquarters, a closed-door meeting was held, and Elijah's name appeared on a nomination list for a special honor. One nominator wrote, "We often honor heroes after they've died, but some people live, walk among us, judged by the color of their skin, and still never lose their presence. Elijah is one of them." And something unprecedented happened. No one opposed the nomination. Cole, on the other hand, faced the opposite fate. After being suspended and placed under criminal investigation, he all but vanished. Some sources reported he had hired a lawyer and was attempting to spin the case as being provoked due to ignorance of the other party's identity. But the more he tried to justify himself, the more the internet resurfaced. A new post listed previous complaints against Cole that had been buried for lack of evidence. Now, no one needed more proof. They only needed the pattern. Every victim was a person of color, and none received fair treatment. A television program invited veterans to share their thoughts. An elderly soldier with silver hair and a trembling voice choked up as he said, "I once stood on the same front lines with men like Elijah. It wasn't his skin that made him stand out, it was his heart, bigger than any trench. We don't need him to fight back because the way he refused to kneel to wrongness made us proud." In a high school classroom in Atlanta, a teacher played the video and asked students to write letters to a soldier. One boy wrote, "Uncle Elijah, I don't know you, but I saw you weren't afraid. I hope one day I can stand like you even when people around me laugh." From there, hundreds of letters poured into a temporary inbox set up by a group of college students, created to send words of love to Elijah. Finally, while everyone waited for a speech or a public appearance, Elijah chose a different way to show up. No television, no social media, just a school visit. No one knew he was coming. He simply walked into the classroom where the teacher had shown the video and stood quietly at the back. One student recognized his face. whispered, and the whole class fell silent. Elijah smiled and said, "I didn't come to tell my story. I came to listen to yours, about what this country still needs to relearn how to listen when others are silent." He didn't need a spotlight. He didn't need to reclaim the stage. Elijah made society confront itself through the way he lived, calm yet powerful enough to shake every false value to its core. And that is why, when the entire country began to say his name, the change didn't come from outrage, but from a deeper question. If Elijah Grant was treated this way, how many others have gone unseen? In places far from the spotlight, from a barber shop in Texas to a repair shop in Detroit, people still speak his name as a symbol. Not because he hit someone or won something, but because he didn't hit, didn't strike back, and still made the entire nation change. That is the pinnacle of resistance. Resistance through dignity. Elijah didn't have to chase justice because his very existence forced justice to show up. And when one person can make an entire system answer just by being present, no one can dismiss him, not even those who once tried. The meeting room at the Federal Investigation Office wasn't large, but the air inside was so heavy it felt burdensome just to breathe. Charlotte Hughes stood before the projection screen, flipping through each slide with a cold expression. On the screen were stills from the video, each frame enlarged, numbered, and cross-referenced. Every glance, every pause, every word spoken by Cole and Elijah's silent gaze were extracted and analyzed with specialized software, annotated with notes like threatening behavior, aggressive tone, and contemptuous interaction. At the far end of the table sat representatives from the Department of Justice, the Office of Civil Rights, and the military. The presence of the military wasn't because Elijah requested it, but because the incident had transcended a typical case of misconduct. It had shaken national honor. Colonel Whitman, who oversaw military personnel and had worked directly with Elijah, began, "This isn't just an investigation into two officers. This is an inquiry into a system that allowed them to believe they could act this way without consequence." Charlotte nodded. "We are constructing a profile model of internalized racial bias. Riker may be a key link in confirming the prevalence of silence in the face of wrongdoing." Outside the conference room, public pressure mounted. News outlets repeatedly requested interviews, demanded the names of those involved in covering up the incident, and even called for the release of internal meeting content. Still, the investigation remained confidential. All the public knew was Cole's record is under full review. Meanwhile, Cole was summoned to federal headquarters for formal interrogation. He sat alone in the interview room, no longer wearing his former air of confidence. When the investigators entered, he looked up slowly and said, "I didn't know who he was." The response was recorded without rebuttal. Moments later, Charlotte placed an enlarged image of the American flag patch on Elijah's sleeve. "And that's why you thought you had the right to humiliate him?" she asked, her voice calm but steely. Cole fell silent and took a deep breath. At the same time, Riker was also summoned, not for questioning, but into a private room where two civil rights attorneys were already seated. Charlotte entered after them, looking at him for a long moment before speaking. "You weren't the instigator, but you stood there when it happened." Riker bowed his head, his voice barely audible. "I was scared. In that moment I was afraid of him and of everyone around us." Charlotte crossed her arms and stared at him. "And now? Are you still afraid?" Riker looked up. "I'm afraid that if I stay silent again, there'll be nothing left of me to salvage." Riker signed the cooperation agreement, agreeing to serve as a witness. His testimony made the case undeniable. Conversations before shifts, radio recordings, and even a confession that Cole had once threatened him if he ever sided with those snowflake justice types. Charlotte understood this case no longer involved just one man. It was peeling back layers of an entrenched system that had enabled cover-ups for years. Online, investigative journalists began to trace the patterns. They uncovered ignored files, complaints previously dismissed for lack of evidence, most involving misconduct by Cole and other officers in his unit. An independent report boldly stated, "The system isn't blind. It sees but chooses to close its eyes." The article was shared over 500,000 times in 2 days. As for Elijah, he remained silent. But that silence was no longer an ellipsis. It was the weight of a system waiting to be held accountable. One day, a special aide from the Deputy Secretary of Defense arrived at the investigation office carrying a handwritten letter from Elijah addressed to Charlotte. In it, he wrote, "I don't need them imprisoned. I need them unmasked, stripped of the facade they wore when they entered that diner. I don't want revenge. I want them to face themselves without evasion." That letter was added to the internal case file, but news of it leaked. Instead of backlash, it deepened the public's respect for Elijah. A man publicly humiliated, yet capable of writing such words, this was the integrity society had been missing. In the town of Reddens, Ruby's Diner officially closed its doors for good. The owner announced retirement for personal safety reasons. Locals taped a plain white sheet to the window. "We once sat here and watched. Now we can no longer pretend we didn't see." That admission, though late, marked the beginning of redemption. At the local police station, a new sign was mounted. "All acts of racial discrimination, direct or indirect, will be investigated and dealt with strictly." No one clapped when the sign went up, but at least this time it wasn't taken down in silence. That evening, the national broadcast ended with a line that made the entire country pause. Elijah Grant didn't retaliate, but society responded to him. And that is what justice should truly mean, not punishment, but awakening. And in that awakening, the first door opened. The investigation had begun, but something greater, change, was only just being stirred. Elijah didn't demand justice just for himself. He made an entire system question whether it still deserved the badges it wore. The investigation files thickened by the day, not only because old evidence was being unearthed, but because of the sudden surge in voluntary testimonies. One by one, witnesses and former employees at the Reddens Police Department called the federal office, not because they were forced, but because they couldn't stay silent any longer. Some spoke with trembling voices about seeing Cole shove a young black teen against the holding cell glass just for asking, "Why am I being arrested?" Others described the fear in a young woman's eyes when Riker took away her right to record during a late-night traffic stop. The long silence of so many years was finally broken not by shouting, but by a stream of tears and seemingly small stories that together formed a system. Charlotte Hughes knew this. She documented every testimony, tagged every name, mapped every file, and slowly a picture emerged. Not just a Cole, not just a Riker, but a quiet machine behind them, one that kept injustice running like a normal part of daily operations. On Friday afternoon, Charlotte held a closed meeting with representatives from the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights Oversight. On the table was a proposal for the immediate suspension of 6 officers, including Cole's direct supervisor and 3 others who had previously dismissed misconduct complaints without launching investigations. They all knew, she said, and they chose to do nothing. The suspension order was signed. By the end of the day, every name involved was removed from the department's personnel system. Some were summoned, others quietly submitted resignations. A chain reaction played out under the eyes of a nation watching. That evening, a national news special aired a map showing 10 years of misconduct complaints at the Reddens Police Department. Each red dot marked a report that disappeared without a trace. The anchor's voice dropped. How many Elijahs have there been without a video? How many cases were buried? How many people walked away in silence because they believed they couldn't win against organized contempt? Meanwhile, Riker began to cooperate more fully. No longer the young officer with a lowered head, he entered the evidence room with a thin but resolute gaze. "I was wrong," Riker told Charlotte, "but if you give me the chance, I'll be the reason people like me stop accepting silence as an option. That statement didn't absolve him, but it was included in the investigation report. One of Charlotte's notes read, "Key witness in exposing passive complicity." Elijah still did not speak to the media, but someone photographed him at a closed seminar hosted by the Department of Defense, titled Restoring Integrity in the Social Arena. The image spread across forums as a symbol of resolve. In the photo, he didn't speak. He simply sat in the front row, listening. A young soldier on stage said that for the first time he understood that to serve wasn't just to carry a weapon, but to stand tall in the face of insult without losing oneself. That weekend, a public hearing was held at City Hall. The crowd poured in, bringing questions that had never been allowed before. Why did we stay silent? Who let wrong become the rule? In the audience sat some of Cole's former colleagues, silent now, with no defense left. And at the podium, the town's mayor, long a neutral figure, stood up to apologize. "We let someone like Elijah Grant be treated this way on our soil, and I stand here today to stop hiding from that shame." The next day, officials from the Inspector General's office visited the Federal Investigative Branch. The file in their hands was thicker than anyone expected. A comprehensive reform plan for the entire Redden's municipal system was officially launched, including a mandate to make all personnel meetings public for the next 3 years. They also announced the creation of an independent investigative unit, including community representatives. For the first time, the public would have the right to oversee internal police operations. The press called it a reverse earthquake, where power did not fall into the hands of the strong, but was reclaimed by those once deemed invisible. At a small barber shop in Mississippi, an 8th-grade boy stood in front of the mirror and asked the barber to shave 2 letters into the back of his head, Elijah. When asked why, the boy answered simply, "Because someone has to remind them." And even though it was just a tiny patch of shaved hair, it became a symbol for a new generation. A generation not just seeing injustice, but daring to carve it into their identity as a protest. At the end of the preliminary investigation, Charlotte printed the final report. On the first page, there was no title reading violation or charge, but instead a quote from Elijah's letter. "I don't want them jailed. I want them forced to face themselves." And that, at last, was only the beginning. Because justice for Elijah was never about locking someone up. It was about stripping away each mask, each false layer of armor that gave the illusion of power. And when those masks fall, society no longer has the excuse, "I didn't know," because now everyone has seen, and there's no excuse left to look away. At the start of the week, inside the Federal Investigation Office, another closed-door meeting took place, this time with 2 special federal prosecutors and a team of attorneys specializing in abuse of power cases. Charlotte Hughes stood at the head of the table, her gaze sharp as a blade. In front of her lay a series of sordid files. Riker's testimony, reports documenting Cole's prolonged misconduct, evidence extracted from personal phones, internal radio communications, and surveillance footage from the Redden's police station, all pointing in one direction. The violations were no longer isolated acts. It was collective complicity. "We're not stopping at administrative measures," Charlotte said, flipping through the documents. "We're proceeding with criminal prosecution." That statement marked the end of a long cycle of cover-ups. The faces around the room no longer held doubt. Justice, at last, would have teeth and bite. Immediately following the meeting, the chief prosecutor approved the decision to open criminal charges on 2 counts: abuse of authority in the performance of duties with racial discrimination, and obstruction of justice by concealing the misconduct of a fellow officer. The recommended sentence could reach up to 20 years for Cole and up to 10 years for others within the police leadership structure. The criminal prosecution was announced publicly, accompanied by a commitment to hold a transparent and open trial. The news sent shockwaves across the country. Legal forums, bar associations, and civil rights organizations simultaneously released statements. No one stands above the law, even if they wear a badge. At a Georgetown University seminar, a renowned law professor commented, "This isn't merely an isolated case. It's a verdict on a culture that has survived too long by silencing dissent. Students stood and applauded when he closed his speech with, "Elijah Grant didn't need to speak. His silence forced all of us to speak." In Reddens, once the backyard of hushed handshakes and dismissive gestures, a new kind of fear emerged. Town leaders, retired officers, and those once considered untouchable had grown conspicuously quiet. They no longer gave interviews or lashed out on social media. Some quietly sold their homes and left. The public didn't need to drive them out. The truth alone had left them with nowhere to hide. Meanwhile, the military sent a thick dossier with a request to cooperate. All records of Elijah Grant's contributions, achievements, and performance reviews would be made public in court, serving as evidence of his character, ethics, and public service record. Elijah did not intervene in the process. He made no appearances and released no statements. But he didn't need to, because the truth was speaking for him. On Wednesday morning, Riker was officially summoned to provide sworn testimony under witness protection. Sitting before the camera, his voice was slow and heavy. "I never thought I'd say this publicly, but Cole once made it clear he wouldn't let anyone in this town act superior, especially not some black guy in a soldier's jacket. I heard it with my ears, and I stayed silent. I was wrong." A portion of the statement aired on the evening news. Though his face was blurred, the town knew exactly who he was, and his belated courage was met with sympathy, not judgment. A group of young attorneys in California launched a website called Justice for the Quiet, collecting similar cases. They made all Elijah documents publicly accessible, not in violation of the law, but to help the public understand the legal process underway. Every timeline, document, and detailed analysis was another nail sealing the door once shielded by power. On Friday evening, a 20-minute nationwide special broadcast replayed the original video from Ruby's Diner, but this time, every frame was tied to investigative findings, and each of Elijah's expressions contrasted with Cole's behavior. No longer a shocking clip, it had become a criminal dossier, a visual indictment that left no room for denial. And in that report, for the first time, viewers learned that before the video's release, Elijah had been appointed as an advisor for an ethical rehabilitation program in the military. In a closed-door session, he once said, "When honor becomes decoration, human dignity is forgotten. Don't let that happen to the military, and don't let that happen to the nation." That statement, once released, struck straight at the heart of every American still clinging to righteousness, not because Elijah was a victim, but because he had stood at the crossroads of life and death and still chose the path of honor. In her daily report, Charlotte scribbled a handwritten note. "We're not investigating because he's Elijah. We're investigating because no more Elijahs should be treated this way." And with that, the first trial was set, 3 weeks away. On social media, the question emerged, does Cole regret it? But a more important one followed. How many more like Cole are we willing to tolerate? As for Elijah, he remained silent. He didn't need to speak, because by now his mere existence was the loudest declaration. Justice doesn't need to scream. It only needs to stand. And light, no matter how many times it's trampled, can still shine from silence. Elijah was not just a witness. He was the beginning. And that is why this truth cannot be buried. The town of Redden sat in an unusually quiet haze. Those who had once gathered at the cafe where Elijah was humiliated now only dared to glance at one another when passing through Main Street. The sign for Ruby's Diner had been taken down. No one claimed ownership. No one dared to continue business on the tiled floor that had once held the weight of a man who shook the entire system. In a town built on familiarity, no one wanted to be the last one standing with the memory of that fateful phone call. Inside a large meeting room at the Department of Justice, Charlotte Hughes presented to a federal panel. Every report was displayed on the big screen. Maps of police departments with the highest rates of dismissed internal complaints, statistics on public hearings, and percentages of internal resolutions without outside oversight. She closed with a magnified chart in which Redden stood out as a dark red dot, stark against the pale gray background. "We're no longer talking about individual officers," Charlotte said, her eyes sweeping the row of seats. We're talking about how America has allowed local power to run without brakes. And today, we're bringing a case to court to ask ourselves who removed the brakes in the first place. At the same time, a reporter from The Atlantic tracked down a lesser-known figure, Riker. The young officer, now out of the force, lived temporarily in a small suburban apartment. In an article titled "The Reluctant Whistleblower," Riker admitted, "I used to think that as long as I didn't do wrong, I was one of the good guys. But the truth is, I stood there in silence. I enabled it, and now I carry it." The story spread rapidly, not because people felt sorry for him, but because they saw themselves in him, in compromise, in the brief moment of looking away that leads to consequences stretching miles. 3 days before the trial, Elijah's legal team submitted a file requesting the public testimony of 10 additional witnesses. Among them were 3 former department supervisors and 2 individuals who had buried evidence from illegal stops. One had been retired for nearly 10 years. The file bore a single line: "Silence does not expire with retirement." Around the same time, a military forum resurfaced an old interview with Elijah, in which he said, "Every decision I made on the battlefield was weighed in 10 seconds. But the wounds I carry have lasted 10 years, and I've accepted that, because they came from enemies. What I can't accept is having my honor spat on by my people." The clip garnered over 2 million views in 24 hours. Elijah offered no comment. He remained silent by choice, not to detach from emotion, but to center the truth in a space where no one was yelling over it anymore. The Federal Investigative Office has now received a surge of requests from other states. Citizens who had witnessed injustice but were ignored. They sent videos, old complaints, even scraps of paper with times and locations, things no one had ever cared to hear. And for the first time in years, from one single case, a web of resonance began to form. Elijah was not the target, he was the focal point. 24 hours before the trial, the mayor of Redlands held a public press conference. His face looked worn, the glasses on his nose trembling slightly. "I take full responsibility before this community," he said, "for allowing such a system to exist under my leadership. I never thought this could happen in our town." No one clapped, no one protested. They simply remained quiet because everything that needed to be heard had been said. Now it was time to see who would act. That night, Elijah stood at the window of his reserved hotel room, watching the traffic below. No one recognized him. There was no media, no security detail, no flashes. But he stood there, silent, holding an old photo, his unit from 1999. Some in the photo were gone, some had lost limbs, and others had scattered across the country, but all of them had once believed they were fighting for a cause. The next morning, in a high-security zone, Elijah entered the courthouse through a side gate. He didn't speak, didn't look around, but those present looked up. They knew who he was, and they knew why he was there. Because out of hundreds of thousands who had been wronged, he was the one who made the system look at itself. Elijah didn't do anything extraordinary, he simply stood his ground. And sometimes, in a world where bowing your head means survival, the one who stands still is the one who causes the storm. And in that moment, people finally understood. The cost of a phone call isn't in making it, it's whether you dare to make it. And Elijah, through his steady refusal to compromise, had forced America to pick up the phone again, but this time to answer itself. Early in the morning, the federal courthouse in Southern Virginia overflowed with people waiting in line. They weren't there to protest or cheer. They came because they wanted to witness the truth for themselves. Not retellings, not clipped videos, but a clear portrait of an America confronting itself. The courthouse glass reflected the long line of attendees, from law students and veterans to people who had never dared speak about what they had seen. They stood as still as statues. No slogans, no signs, because everyone understood that when true justice is on trial, silence becomes the loudest voice. Elijah arrived earlier than his scheduled appearance, unaccompanied by any lawyer, carrying only a small folder and the medal pinned directly to his shirt pocket. Standing at the gate, he paused for a few seconds, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. No one shoved, no one raised a phone, but many eyes turned red, not from pity, but from respect. Elijah gave a slight nod, then stepped inside. The courtroom froze when he appeared. Cole sat across the room, face expressionless, hands clenched tightly. Beside him, his defense attorney whispered something, but Cole gave no reply. Riker sat in the back, his expression unreadable, his gaze avoiding Elijah. And when the judge entered, all eyes turned to the one man who did not bow his head. The trial began with a reading of the charges: abuse of authority with racial bias, obstruction of investigation, falsifying incident reports, and using official position to demean a citizen. The steady cadence of the reading echoed like a long-awaited list of offenses finally being named. Within each word, one could hear the echoes of years of silence, of hundreds of dismissed accounts labeled too emotional. When the prosecutor rose, the indictment didn't focus on Elijah's identity. Instead, they played the original video, the unedited version before it went viral, before public outrage. It simply ran, from Elijah walking into the diner, the server's look, to the first comment from a nearby table. Who does he think he is in that ragged soldier's coat? Elijah was called as the first witness. He stood, walked to the stand without assistance or instruction. When asked to confirm his identity, he simply said, "Elijah Grant, veteran, federal-level strategic security advisor." And that was the first time everyone in the room heard him state his title, not as a boast, but to clarify that what he had endured wasn't because he was weak, but because society had failed to respect what mattered most. The defense attorney asked, "So you believe the officer was not simply following protocol when questioning a man of unknown identity lingering in a diner?" Elijah replied succinctly, "If protocol means shoving someone before asking for ID, then we are talking about a regime, not a law enforcement agency." The judge's gavel called for order, but it couldn't stop the shifting glances around the room. From that point on, the trial delved deeper. Each testimony, each internal report, each email from the Reddens Police Department revealed a tangled web, and at its center was Cole, once considered the town's keeper of order. Riker took the stand next. He did not look at Elijah, but his voice was clearer than before. "I don't feel proud speaking here today, but I know now. If I stay silent, I'll have to live with it like a part of my body has rotted." Then he turned to Cole, softly but firmly. "You once said they need to know who runs these streets. But the streets aren't yours. They belong to everyone, regardless of skin color." The trial lasted all day. As the sun began to dip, the judge concluded with a short statement. "The court does not exist to bestow honor on anyone, but it does exist to restore honor that was unlawfully taken. And today, we do that not for one individual, but for all those who've been demeaned by someone who believed they had the right to." The session adjourned temporarily for the jury to deliberate on further prosecution measures, but the first decision had already been made. Cole would be held in custody immediately pending final judgment without bail, and as he was led past the gallery, for the first time, he did not dare lift his head. Elijah exited the courthouse in silence. The small group outside clapped quietly. An elderly man took his hand, and a child raised a phone to record without live streaming. No one needed to know his name. They only knew he had stood, not for vengeance, but to restore something many thought no longer existed: justice. That evening, before returning home, Elijah sat alone on a bench in front of the courthouse. No one disturbed him. The wind passed through the trees, carrying the last leaves of the season. He looked up at the sky, eyes neither angry nor in pain, just at peace, because he knew his fight this time had not been in vain. And for the first time, the nation witnessed a white trial, not defined by the color of those involved, but by the undeniable clarity of a truth that had long been obscured. Elijah didn't win. Elijah simply didn't lose. And in a country that had so often looked away, that was already a beginning. After the trial, Reddens was no longer a place where people could walk into a diner and pretend nothing had happened. The signs that once hung along Main Street were gradually taken down or renamed. Ruby's Diner closed permanently. The former owner listed it for a rock-bottom price, but no one wanted to buy. No one wanted to carry on a memory that had become a symbol of national shame. On social media, the phrase "breakfast in hell" became shorthand for that moment. In the images that once seemed ordinary, a cup of coffee shoved across the table, a sneer, now appeared in ethics lectures, social studies classes, and legal workshops as vivid proof that prejudice is never harmless. At the local high school, the history teacher devoted an entire class period to showing students the original video, not to make them angry, but to teach them how to see, not through narration, not through explanation, but through direct experience. After the clip, a student raised their hand and asked, "If he didn't have a title, where would this have gone?" The teacher paused, then answered, "That's what we have to change." The town's police department was placed under special supervision for 3 consecutive months. Nearly 10 officers were suspended, and 2 were charged with falsifying records in arrests involving black individuals. A new team was deployed from the state level, not to take control, but to retrain the entire force from the ground up in ethics and conduct. Leading the team was a black woman who had once served as police chief in Chicago. She gave no lengthy speech, only said during the first meeting, "I didn't come here to make you fear me. I came to make sure you fear yourselves when you do wrong." Cole was held in solitary confinement at a military prison awaiting formal sentencing. His name was no longer mentioned in official documents, only listed as the defendant at the department level. The media stopped running his photo, shifting focus to why a small town like Reddens had managed to maintain such a system for years without question. On talk shows, the debate never ceased. If Elijah had been a nobody, would this have ever been pursued to the end? And that question elevated the story to a systemic level, where everyone had to face a truth, that justice had long relied on reputation, not reality. As for Elijah, he didn't return to the media, nor did he accept any interview requests. He went back to a small house more than an hour's drive from Reddens, living with an old dog that had lost one eye in the war. Every morning he brewed coffee, read books, and tended to 2 apple trees in his front yard. Letters poured in from all over, filling his mailbox. He kept the handwritten ones, left the printed ones in an unopened cardboard box. On some days, he received invitations from the government to serve as a senior advisor on civil law reforms, but he declined. In his reply, he wrote only one line, "I've done my part. Now it's your turn." 1 month after the trial, a group of law students came to his house. They hadn't made an appointment, just left an envelope and a printed article titled "The Man Who Woke Justice." Elijah read the piece, smiled, folded it, and placed it on the shelf. He didn't need flattery. He only needed to know that after everything, people had stopped treating silence as the easiest option. In Washington, a closed-door meeting was held among internal agencies to discuss reforms for civil complaint responses against law enforcement. The new proposal was titled the Grant Protocol, inspired by how Elijah faced the incident without surrender. Under the plan, any complaint involving racial discrimination would bypass local channels and go straight to an independent federal oversight office. The media called it the aftershock of 3 minutes of silence. But those who truly understood knew it wasn't an aftershock. It was the first incision in a long overdue operation. An independent filmmaker reached out to Elijah's attorney, proposing to turn the story into a documentary. They weren't chasing drama, but truth. Each glance, each word, each humiliation that had become a reason for awakening. But Elijah declined. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted people to reflect without needing another sacrifice. On a stone wall in the state library, a quote from Elijah during the trial was engraved. "I don't need an apology. I need a country where my child doesn't have to make a call just to be respected." Below it, there was no photo, no title, only a small line, "Elijah Grant, the man who stood still." And then life went on, but at a different rhythm, slower, more deliberate, because those who had witnessed would no longer look away so easily. Those who once thought themselves uninvolved now understood. By staying silent, they had chosen a side. And that, as Elijah once said, is the kind of betrayal no one prosecutes. but your conscience will never forget. There was no applause at the end of this chapter, no bright lights, just a narrow road in front of Elijah's home, where he occasionally stepped out, looked up at the sky, sipped his coffee, then went back inside. Everything was quiet, but nothing was the same. And in that, a silent chapter of history had been written, with an unyielding stance, an unwavering gaze, and a heart that knew true respect should never have to be requested. It should be assumed. Elijah had remained silent for weeks after everything ended. No statements, no press conferences, no actions beyond his daily routines, rising early, walking through the garden, tending to his apple trees, and sitting on the balcony with a hot cup of coffee in hand. He seemed unchanged after the greatest psychological battlefield of his life. But within that stillness, something had begun to spread, like morning mist seeping into the hardest stones, silent, but leaving behind a visible trace of moisture. One weekend afternoon, a student named Malik, the one who had filmed the diner incident, came to visit. He didn't arrive as a fan or someone seeking advice. He came to apologize. Malik stood at Elijah's gate, his shirt wrinkled, holding an old phone. Elijah looked at him through the window for a moment before stepping outside, asking no questions, only nodding slightly as if he already knew. Malik's words came out broken, his eyes dropped, hands trembling. I filmed the video, but at the time, I didn't stand up. I filmed it because I thought it would go viral. But I didn't do anything. Elijah didn't reply immediately. He simply looked at him without judgment. Eventually, he sat down on the wooden porch chair and gestured for Malik to join him. "You did what many others didn't dare to do," Elijah said. "You held the camera steady while the room shook with insults. That wasn't cowardice. That was action. And by coming back here, not out of guilt but to understand what truly happened that day, you've changed because of it." Malik looked at him as if someone had just removed a tumor from his chest that he hadn't known was there. The conversation didn't last long, but he left with completely different eyes. A few days later, the first article appeared in the university student magazine, "When the camera is no longer a weapon, but a mirror." Elijah read it, and for the first time he smiled. Not long after, a professor from Howard University invited Elijah to speak at an annual event on justice. At first, he declined, but eventually agreed, not because he wanted to speak, but because he wanted to observe. The talk was held in a small auditorium where students were packed onto old wooden benches. Elijah stepped to the podium with no slides, no notes. He looked directly into the front rows and began to recount his experience, not with fire, but with a low, steady voice, like the heartbeat of someone who had survived. "There were days I felt split in two. One half wanted to shout in the face of those who insulted me. The other half wanted to walk away, but I didn't. I stayed, not because I was strong, but because I needed them to see themselves in my eyes, not shriveled, not screaming, but with dignity so intact they had to look down." The auditorium remained perfectly still. Elijah continued, his voice soft yet unwavering. "Justice is not something we build with our hands. It is something we preserve by refusing to accept what is wrong, even if only through a silent gaze." After the talk, students rushed up asking for pictures, but he simply stood there, touched each shoulder, and said, "Let me remember you by your eyes." They nodded, and that refusal of spectacle made Elijah all the more remembered. Meanwhile, his name continued to circulate on social media, but this time there were no sensational headlines. Instead, people posted reflections like, "I used to think I was just a bystander, but after what happened in Reddens, I understand. I'm a witness, and responsibility can't be avoided." New hashtags emerged, like Stand and See and Elijah Effect, not as outrage, but as quiet reminders. In this world, everyone has a role, whether the one holding the camera, the one who stood by, or the one who spoke out. One evening, Elijah received a letter from a man who had once been a police officer, now retired because he couldn't stomach how colleagues treated the public. In the letter, the man wrote, "I once stayed silent and have lived with that silence like a weight that grows heavier each day. but after seeing you stand your ground while being dragged down in a crowd, I've begun speaking again, to my family, to my driving students, to the man I see in the mirror each morning." Elijah didn't write back, but the next morning, he pinned that letter to the wooden board above his desk, alongside photos of his old comrades from the military, a way to remember that even small actions, if done at the right moment, in the right place, can awaken parts of morality that had long been asleep within people. In Reddens, a group of high school students began hosting discussions about public conduct culture. They used Elijah's case as their first lesson. In one classroom session, a white boy stood up and said, "I used to think my grandparents were just being dramatic when they talked about black people. But after that day, I argued with them for the first time. I don't want to grow up blind." The remark was recorded and shared online as part of the legacy Elijah left behind, one that needed no engraving. And so, the next chapter of the story no longer took place in courtrooms, media outlets, or offices. It unfolded in every changed gaze, every small but persistent act of resistance. Elijah no longer needed to speak, because his voice had already resonated through countless others. One day, a publishing house called, offering him a book deal. Elijah listened, then quietly smiled. "I've already written it, on the faces of those I've met, in the changes embedded in the words they've sent back." As winter arrived, most of the leaves fell from the apple trees in his yard. Elijah still sat there, on that same old wooden chair, beneath the soft gray sky and the crisp chill in the wind. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. No more anger, no need for justification. It was this silence that truly signified change. A town that had learned to listen, a country that had begun to open its eyes, and a man who had said everything he needed without having to raise his voice. And so, in silence, he continued writing, not with ink, but through the world's response. When the storm of media attention had subsided, those who remained in Reddens had to confront the one thing they could no longer avoid: the consequences of complicity. Not everyone in town had insulted Elijah, but nearly all had witnessed it and done nothing. And now, with no more cameras, no more reporters, each person began to face their reflection with the very gaze they had once avoided. Lucille, the young waitress who had handed Elijah his coffee with a half-hearted attitude, no longer worked at Ruby's, not because she was fired, but because she quit. After the video spread, people messaged her hateful words, and some even came to the diner to berate her. But what she couldn't bear most was her mother's gaze, who had watched the video through tears and said, "Did you forget who you are?" Lucille tried to justify herself, saying she was just going along with the room, that she didn't mean to offend, but every excuse crumbled under one question: if you knew it was wrong, why didn't you stop? From that day on, Lucille never put her server's uniform in the wash again. She folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer, and applied for a job at a community support center. In town, some people tried to act as if nothing had happened, but gradually voices rose from those who had once been silent. The mechanic, who had muttered mockingly when Elijah entered the diner, became the first to sign the petition demanding retraining for the town's entire law enforcement. He didn't explain much, only said one thing to his old friends: "I'm tired of explaining to my kid why his dad laughed when someone got humiliated." Reddens Elementary introduced a new class called Observe and Act, where teachers guided students on how to respond when witnessing injustice, whether in the classroom, on the playground, or at home. At first, some parents protested, calling it a way to foster rebellion. But when the principal played the video of Elijah as proof that good people can be crushed when no one speaks up, they had nothing left to say. One mother, who had signed the protest, returned to her child's teacher and admitted, "I used to tell my kid not to get involved in other people's business. Now I realize if I teach him to look away, someday he'll look at me like I'm a coward." Meanwhile, Riker, the young officer who had accompanied Cole, was living under suspension, pending investigation for complicity. Every time he stepped outside, he had to lower his gaze to avoid familiar eyes. But what haunted him most wasn't the whispers. It was his father's eyes, a retired military officer who had once taught him that A real man doesn't need power to defend what's right. Riker hadn't lived up to that. He hadn't hit Elijah, hadn't shouted, but he had stood still, and that stillness had become a weight he couldn't shake. One evening, Riker wrote a letter to Elijah, not to ask for forgiveness, but to recount the moment he had wanted to stop Cole and didn't. He wrote, "I know I no longer deserve to wear the badge, but if you see anything in me worth keeping, please say so. If not, I accept losing it all." Elijah didn't respond immediately, but a week later, Riker received a small envelope with a handwritten note. "Knowing you're wrong is one step. Saying it out loud is the next step. The rest you have to walk on your own." From people like Riker, Lucille, and the mechanic, the town of Reddens began to shift, slowly, like a wound beginning to scab over. They didn't hold healing festivals, didn't build statues, didn't call Elijah a hero. They simply changed, quietly, by not laughing when someone was mocked, by not looking away when someone was bullied, and, most importantly, by starting to ask why instead of who's to blame. The new mayor, who replaced the one removed for covering up misconduct, was a Latina woman who had grown up in a poor neighborhood in the next state. She didn't promise to erase all injustice, but she made one commitment. From now on, every complaint sent to my office must be addressed publicly, with a signature and someone accountable. That sentence became the slogan printed above the newly renovated City Hall entrance. Justice has no shortcut. At a spring town hall, where residents were invited to speak about the town's new direction, an elderly white man who had been eating breakfast at Ruby's the day it all happened stood up. He held the microphone with trembling hands, his eyes red. I sat less than 5 steps from him. I heard every word, saw every act. I chose to lower my head to the newspaper. I thought, not my business. And now, every night, I see his eyes as he was being humiliated right in front of me. I don't know how to make it right, but I won't let my life end in silence. His words echoed in the still room. No one clapped, but those present understood. A town begins to heal not with monuments, but with confessions. This part doesn't end with a period, but with a quiet ellipsis, because the most important thing wasn't what Elijah did, it was what those around him chose to do after. And that quiet transformation, from those once thought to be insignificant, turned the story into something greater than one man. It became the story of a community that had once bowed its head, but now dared to raise it. Since the incident in Reddens, the name Elijah was no longer just a name. It had become a symbol, but not in the way the world usually treats those pushed into symbolic status. Glorified, mythologized, and eventually forgotten. Elijah remained a slow-walking, soft-spoken man who refused to let anyone use his story as a political tool. But he understood that his name no longer belonged solely to him. It was mentioned in classrooms, in hearings, in student essays, even appearing in the draft for police reform legislation in the state of Georgia as a living example of the phrase, "wrong in attitude defeated by prejudice." One early summer day, Elijah received an invitation to attend a memorial and policy forum in Washington, D.C., where state leaders and military representatives were gathering to propose amendments to federal oversight of local police conduct. The sender of the letter did not address him by any title, simply writing, "The man who did the right thing when everyone else chose to look away." Elijah read the letter, folded it carefully, and for the first time in many years called his old friend General McCready, who had served with him on numerous missions. They did not talk much about the past. Elijah asked, "Do you think I should go?" McCready replied, "I don't think, I know you have to." And so Elijah nodded, not for the honor of the invitation, but because he knew being present was the duty of someone who had witnessed the rawest truths of justice and still stood firm. At the event, Elijah did not speak. He sat in the second row, among those not on stage but who embodied the spirit of the entire forum. Among them was Malik, now an editor for an independent political and social magazine. He looked at Elijah with the eyes of someone who had walked through darkness and was grateful to the man who lit the way. Also present was the mayor of Reddens, representing a community that once bowed its head, now raising it, not to justify, but to relearn how to walk upright. When the host read the list of those who had played a crucial role in reform, he paused at the line, Elijah, the man who needed no title to force the system to see itself. The entire hall stood and applauded. Elijah remained seated. He didn't want to rise amid applause he had not asked for, but he placed a hand over his heart, a simple gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 words. After the ceremony, a group of students approached Elijah. They asked what he thought when looking back. Elijah paused, then said, "There are things people can't get back. Trust, dignity, sometimes even safety. But the one thing no one can ever take is your choice to keep your self-respect." Another student asked, "If you could do it all over, would you react differently?" Elijah smiled gently. "If I had done things differently, maybe I would have been safer. But who would have told them, those still silent, that you can stand up without losing yourself?" Back in Reddens, Elijah was invited to a new community meeting where residents shared the small steps they'd made since the incident. There were no reporters in the room, no live stream. Just people who had once turned away, now sitting together to speak honestly. The old man, who had once been ashamed during a previous meeting, raised his hand to speak. He shared that he had started walking his grandson through the park, and every time they saw someone being bullied, his grandson would grip his hand tighter, as if to remind him never to stay silent again. "I think I'm not the man I used to be," he said. "I'm the man that child trusts, and I don't have the right to betray that trust." Elijah nodded. He said nothing more, because in that moment, he knew he had left behind something greater than any justification, a living memory that made people question how they existed among others. From then on, Elijah was no longer just the name of a black man in a military coat walking into a diner. It was a reminder that in a world ready to trample dignity, the bravest act is to remain still and not bow your head. On the day Elijah returned home from his travels, he stepped off an old bus near the town's entrance. A young bus driver opened the door and greeted him. "I heard you speak at the DC Forum. I never thought someone from here would make it all the way there." Elijah smiled faintly. "I didn't go up. I just didn't fall." The driver stood silent for a moment, then laughed, not because it was funny, but because it made everything feel a little lighter. When he got home, the apple tree in his yard had started to bear fruit. He sat down in his familiar wooden chair and poured a cup of hot tea. In the distance, children rode their bikes across the street, and a mother walking her dog waved at him. Nothing about the scene was glamorous, but Elijah knew the greatest change doesn't happen where the camera lights shine, but in the quiet ways that old towns begin to live differently. And so, a name once unknown, by sheer steadiness, forced the system to stop, look down, and ask, "Do we still deserve to call ourselves enforcers of justice?" If we averted our eyes when justice was violated. Elijah needed no title, no statue. He needed only one thing, that the world be kinder after it had once been cruel to him. And in that quiet space, his name, once mocked, once ignored, now echoed as a warning, soft yet deep, enough to make those who thought they held power reconsider the cost of silence. Beneath the sky of a once quiet town, now simmering with buried prejudice, the name Elijah had become a deep incision in the collective memory. It all began in a small diner, with a cup of coffee placed on the table, through a gaze of disdain, and two police officers who walked in as if they carried on their shoulders the right to determine someone else's dignity. Elijah did not retaliate with grand speeches. He looked straight ahead, did not step back, and it was that very gaze that shook a system so accustomed to bowed heads. The insults, the dehumanizing actions, the silence of the crowd, and even the laughter of those complicit, together they painted a bitter portrait of how society treats those it deems lesser, even when they carry the wounds of service once shed for this very country. Elijah had not come there to become a symbol. He only wanted to drink a cup of coffee like any other citizen. But when he was dragged, mocked, had his chair pulled away, his jacket yanked, and was insulted for the color of his skin and his homeless veteran appearance, Elijah chose not to retreat, but to stand. Not to strike back with fists, but to make a phone call. Just one line, "Let me speak directly with the office," and from there, everything changed. Personnel from the Pentagon arrived, amid glances that hovered between disbelief and suspicion. Elijah left, not in a rush, not with arrogance, But with the stride of a man who knew that dignity is not something others can grant, people began reviewing files, rewatching camera footage, comparing testimonies, and realizing that the truth had long been buried beneath layers of neglect, willful blindness, and habitual dismissal. Abuse of power was not a surprise. It was the inevitable result of a long chain of ignored red flags. Social media exploded, splitting public opinion. One half defended the officers, claiming they were just following protocol. The other half looked deeper into Elijah's eyes that day and asked, if a former military officer, who once stood on the front lines to protect the nation, could be treated that way in broad daylight, then how badly might an ordinary citizen be treated in the shadows? The investigation dragged on, testimonies tangled, and one by one the documents reopened. Hull and Riker, once seen as symbols of law and order in the town, were gradually exposed through a series of inexcusable actions. Overlooked complaints, internal recordings, and falsified reports. Each one revealed a system where conscience had been replaced by routine intimidation. Elijah did not pursue lawsuits. He didn't hire attorneys or give teary testimonies. Instead, he sent letters to those who had witnessed, who had stayed silent, who had laughed along, not to accuse, but to remind them that silence is also a form of violence. His forgiveness did not stem from gentleness, but from the conviction that true healing only comes from real change. From that incident, many towns began revising their internal oversight processes. Police departments were required to record all civilian interactions, and training programs began including the Reddens case as a model. Ironically, those who had once stood against him were now leading reform projects. No one wanted a second Elijah to have to sacrifice their dignity just to awaken the system. The most profound part of this story did not lie in the phone call or the identity twist. It was the fact that Elijah never tried to prove he deserved respect. He did not cite his achievements, did not use his rank as a shield. He simply showed up as an ordinary man, demanding to be treated like a human being. And that was the greatest lesson of all, that dignity does not come from medals, titles, or status, but from the resolve to remain unbroken in the face of contempt. The people of Reddens began telling the story differently. They no longer spoke of Elijah getting his chair pulled by cops. They told their children and grandchildren that once there was a man who dared to make a phone call in the middle of being humiliated, and through that forced an entire town to confront itself. They said that in a diner where no one seemed to know anyone, one quiet man made everyone choose a side, not between black and white, but between right and wrong. And in each of those retellings, Elijah was not cast as a cinematic hero. He remained the same man, with a steady voice, direct eyes, and calloused hands. But he did what an entire power structure feared most. He made those who believed themselves unquestionably right begin to question their righteousness. Elijah's story inspired not because it sparked outrage, but because it reminded people that justice is not some distant concept. It lives in the smallest of acts, in how we serve a cup of coffee, how we look at someone entering a room, or how we react when we hear a demeaning comment. And most importantly, it revived a long-forgotten truth. Silence is also choosing a side. The name Elijah may never be printed in textbooks, but for those who followed the incident, it serves as a reminder that change does not begin with policy. It begins in the moment someone chooses not to look away. Like him, anyone can become the starting point of a wave of change, not through power, not through noise, but through the quiet strength to do what is right at the most wrong time. And when this story ends, perhaps no statue will be built for Elijah, and no plaque will bear his name. But every time someone speaks up for the powerless, every time someone refuses to join in group cruelty, a part of Elijah lives on in them. Not needing recognition, not needing gratitude, just continuation, like a smoldering fire burning quietly within those who refuse to surrender. That is the final victory, not loud, but loud. Just like him, Elijah. Under the fading twilight of a town once stained by prejudice, the name Elijah is no longer just a story about a man humiliated in a diner. It is a symbol of silence turned into action, of a calm gaze strong enough to make an entire system hesitate. That story may close on paper, but its echo will live on each time someone faces injustice and quietly asks themselves, will I look away or will I stay? Elijah never asked anyone to be like him. He simply left behind a path, one where courage doesn't need to shout, and justice begins with a gaze that doesn't turn aside.